Have you ever had one of those moments where you're like, what just happened? And you were just left wondering. If you're a sports fan, you might remember back this fall, and I actually hate to bring this up because it still hurts right here. I was watching, my kids are both Aggies, and so I was watching the game, and up by 30-something in the second half. Oh, what just happened? It was painful. Maybe sports aren't your thing, but you've had that experience somewhere along the line wondering what just happened. Probably it's been on a more serious note than sports that pass and fade after just a few hours and your grief gets taken away. Maybe it was a visit to the oncologist and you heard the word malignant. What just happened? And your whole world gets turned upside down. And everything's out of sorts. What in the world just happened? I think that's where we find Peter in the text today. You'll remember back a few days before this, he was like, oh no, Lord, oh, never renounce you. And then 3 times he renounces him. And he hears the rooster crow, and he went out and he wept bitterly. And now he's still got that heavy feeling on himself. And he hears these ladies saying, he's not there, he's risen. The angels told us. What? What's happening? Sprints off to the tomb. And it says this, he ran to the tomb, and bending over, he saw the strips of the linen lying by themselves, and he went away wondering to himself what had just happened. It was a life-defining moment. What had happened? And so he was on this quest to figure out what's the truth. What really matters? What's going on here? And maybe when you've been at that place where you got that word from the oncologist or somebody served you papers that you didn't want, they said, I don't want to be married to you anymore. You turn and you say, God, is this real? Like Peter was trying to figure out if the resurrection was real. Now, Peter had the benefit of Jesus physically appearing to him. But you know, for the early part of the church, that was still kind of a question. Paul has this huge chapter, 1 Corinthians 15. You could do worse things with your time today than read that chapter. It is the defining chapter of what it means to live a resurrected life, to live a life under the power of the resurrected Christ. And so that question was still going on. 20 years later, people were saying, is that really real? Is that real? You know, in our DFW Metroplex today, a lot of people would probably say, oh, that Christian fairy tale, Easter eggs are about as true as Jesus rising from the dead. About 20 years ago, I remember I had moved to Fort Worth, and one of the prominent downtown churches had a pastor who wrote a piece in the op-ed section of the Star-Telegram. Anybody remember real newspapers? Okay. Millennials are like, what's a newspaper? Anyway, and the point of his paper, the point of his op-ed piece, this prominent pastor, was that really it was just a symbol. The resurrection was a symbol of God. Evil will eventually be conquered by good, but the literal resurrection, no. And most of the feedback that the Star-Telegram, at least what they printed, said, you know, that's probably right. His attitude is very enlightened. And who really believes in that physical resurrection stuff these days? So the question before you and I, is it real? Is it real? So back to 1 Corinthians 15. Paul, this is 20 years after Jesus departing and ascending to heaven, he says this, 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8. For what I received, in other words, the message that I got, and I went and researched and I checked it out, I also passed on to you. I'm reporting to you what I found. And he says this, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. He was buried and raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures. And then he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. And after that, he appeared to more than 500. most of whom are still now living. What he was saying there, you don't have to believe me. You can go talk to Peter if you want. You can go talk to any of these 500 people who are still hanging out. They're still living and breathing. Go ask them. It's real. It's for real. Now, that is a very defining thing. Christianity believes that the resurrection is real, truly real. And if it is real, what has it accomplished? Well, we keep our noses down in 1 Corinthians 15 for a little bit. A lot of people in our culture today believe kind of Lion King theology. Anybody remember the Lion King? You watched this? Yeah. And there was this song in the Lion King, The Circle of Life. Right? Remember that song? Yeah. And in The Circle of Life, now some of you don't remember, but that's okay. I'll tell you about it. In the song, The Circle of Life, it was this kind of concept that death is just a natural thing. Death is just the next phase, and you just got to get ready for it and accept it and move on. It's okay. 1 Corinthians 15. The last enemy to be destroyed is death. Death is an enemy. It is not natural. The poet Dylan Thomas says, "Rage, rage against the dying of the light." What he's trying to say there is, as the light is going out on your life, you fight against it like crazy. I find that to be true. I find that by nature we fight against it. And only those who have the Spirit of Christ living in them, who have the hope of the resurrection, the certain hope, not hope like when my daughter was a teenager, I'd say, "What do you want for your birthday?" She said, "I hope I get a pony and $1 million. That was never going to happen, and she knew it. The resurrection hope is way different. It's a certain hope. What do I mean, a certain hope? 1 Corinthians 15 again says that Jesus was the first fruit of the resurrection. The first fruit of the resurrection means, like, if you have some tomato plants out in your garden right now, and there's these little yellow flowers on them, and soon it'll turn into a little green thing that eventually will turn into a big, fat, juicy beef steak. And you're going to, it's going to be delicious. And the first one that you eat, that's the first fruit. The first one that you get off the plant is the first fruit. But it's just a promise of all the other fruit that is to come. Jesus was the first fruit of the resurrection. It really happened. His life is really alive. The fruit. But we live in this first fruit already but not yet world, where the whole fruit is not going to come in until Jesus returns and makes everything right. So we live in this kind of already but not yet existence, where there's a lot of pain and crud and stuff that hurts like crazy. And if you've lived, you've felt it. It's at the oncologist. It's when the papers come. It's when there's a lot more month than there is paycheck. It's when the grades and the expectations aren't being met. It's when you fill in the blank. But Easter changes everything and makes all the difference. And he goes on in 1 Corinthians 15 to say this at the very end of the chapter, after he's just given this whole glorious rendition of what resurrection life looks like. Paul says this: "Therefore, my dear friends, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourself fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that the labor in the Lord is not in vain." See, God created us to work. God created us to gain dignity through serving Him and serving one another. But Luther, in the way he defines sin in this already but not yet world, he says, instead of doing that, what we do is we curve inward on ourselves. And we become the centers of our own universe. And that's what Luther defined as sin, curving in on yourself. And when you curve in on yourself, your life is very disintegrated from the way God intended it to be. God intended you to live in harmony with Him and with yourself and with each other and with the whole creation. But because of this sin bug that turns ourselves inward on ourselves, we just can't do it. We don't do it. And it takes the power of the resurrection to begin to integrate us, to make us whole and indivisible. You know, if you remember your middle school math, an integer is a whole number, an indivisible number. It's not a fractured number, not a fraction. It's whole. It's undivided. That's the way God intended for us to be, fully integrated, high integrity people. But because we're turned in on ourselves, we aren't. And it takes the power of the resurrection coming into us to start to allow us to receive this awesome power from on high, so then we can turn outward towards others. That happens in the resurrection. And God is calling us to that certain hope. He's calling us to this new life, to this whole new way of thinking. The resurrection is real. This is not a symbol. What we celebrate today is real. Would you just say that with me? It is real.
It is real.
Let that sink in for a second. It is real. So when we start to have these difficult times, when your conscience convicts you and tells you you're not good enough, here's what I'm going to suggest you do. It's what Peter did, and he ran to Jesus. When your marriage is experiencing some challenges, what are you going to do? Run to Jesus. Let's try that. Run to Jesus. When words like cancer or dementia or COPD or whatever start to overwhelm you, run to Jesus.
Run to Jesus.
When your kids are struggling, when your parents are struggling, run to Jesus.
Run to Jesus.
Especially when death comes near. When death comes near, what are you going to do? Run to Jesus. It's exactly what He's called us here today to do, to run to Him in His very body and His blood, to realize that we need again to be made new today. And not only just today, once a year, we need it all the time. As a matter of fact, that's why we gather every Sunday. We run to Him. We're reminded of how good new life under Him is as He gives us power from on high. My friends, run to Him as we sing our next hymn.